When antique dealer Margaret Holloway purchased an ornate Victorian frame at an estate sale, she never imagined the wedding photograph inside would lead her down a path of supernatural terror. The bride's smile seemed perfect, her dress pristine, but when Margaret examined the bouquet under magnification, skeletal fingers were clearly visible gripping the flower stems from within the blooms themselves. What she discovered next about Evelyn Carter's wedding day in 1907 would shake her faith in everything she thought she knew about life, death, and the bonds that refuse to break. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Holloway Antiques as Margaret carefully unwrapped her latest acquisition. She had spent the better part of her Saturday morning at the Whitmore estate sale, competing with other dealers for the choicest pieces from the sprawling Victorian mansion that had stood empty for nearly 3 decades. The ornate silver frame had caught her eye immediately, its intricate engravings and pristine condition suggesting it had been cherished by its original owners. Margaret adjusted her reading glasses and held the frame up to the lamplight. The photograph inside showed a wedding scene from what appeared to be the early 1900s, based on the bride's high-necked dress and elaborate veil. The couple stood before what looked like a small countryside chapel, surrounded by a handful of wedding guests in period attire. The groom, a tall man with a stern mustache, stood rigid beside his bride, his hand resting formally on her arm. It was the bride who captured Margaret's attention most completely. Evelyn Carter, according to the faded inscription on the back of the frame, possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed to transcend the limitations of the old photograph. Her dark hair was swept up beneath a crown of orange blossoms, and her wedding dress, though simple by modern standards, fitted her slender frame perfectly. The silk fabric seemed to shimmer even in the sepia tones of the old image. But there was something about Evelyn's expression that made Margaret pause. While wedding photographs from that era typically showed stoic, unsmiling faces due to long exposure times, Evelyn's lips curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. Her eyes, though difficult to make out clearly in the aged photograph, seemed to hold a depth of emotion that was unusual for formal portraits of the period. Margaret set the frame on her workbench and reached for her magnifying glass, a tool she used regularly to examine the fine details of antique jewelry and miniature paintings. As she leaned closer to study the intricate beadwork on Evelyn's dress, something in the bouquet caught her eye. The flowers appeared to be roses and lilies, traditional choices for a bride of that era, but there was something odd about the way they were arranged. She adjusted the magnifying glass, bringing the bouquet into sharper focus. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. There, clearly visible beneath the magnification, were what appeared to be skeletal fingers wrapped around the flower stems. Not metaphorical or symbolic skeletal fingers, but actual bone-white appendages that seemed to be gripping the bouquet from within the blooms themselves. Margaret blinked hard and looked again, certain that her eyes were playing tricks on her. She had been working long hours lately, preparing for the autumn antique fair, and fatigue could certainly cause visual distortions. But no matter how many times she examined the photograph, the skeletal fingers remained clearly visible, their bone-white surfaces contrasting starkly with the dark stems of the flowers. She set down the magnifying glass and rubbed her eyes, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. In her 25 years as an antique dealer, she had encountered countless old photographs, many with unusual or unexplained elements that could be attributed to photographic techniques of the era, chemical staining calm, or simple optical illusions. But this was different. The skeletal fingers were too distinct, too perfectly formed to be dismissed as a photographic anomaly. Margaret reached for her phone and took several close-up photographs of the bouquet, then transferred them to her computer where she could examine them on a larger screen. The digital enlargement only confirmed what she had seen through the magnifying glass. The skeletal fingers were undeniably present, each bone clearly defined, each joint visible in disturbing detail. Her hands trembling slightly, Margaret turned the frame over and carefully removed the backing. The photograph was mounted on heavy cardstock, and behind it she found a folded piece of paper that had yellowed with age. She unfolded it carefully, revealing what appeared to be a wedding announcement clipped from a local newspaper. The headline read, "Miss Evelyn Carter, weds Mr. Jonathan Whitmore in private ceremony. The article, dated September 15, 1907, provided details about the wedding that had taken place at St. Mary's Chapel in the village of Millbrook. It described Evelyn as the daughter of the late Dr. Henry Carter, a respected physician who had served the community for over 30 years before his death the previous winter. But it was the second clipping, folded beneath the first, that made Margaret's blood run cold. This one was dated just 3 days after the wedding announcement, and its headline was stark and devastating. "Young bride dies suddenly, buried in wedding dress." Margaret read the brief article with growing unease. According to the newspaper account, Evelyn Carter Whitmore had died unexpectedly on September 18, 1907, just 3 days after her wedding to Jonathan Whitmore. The cause of death was listed simply as sudden illness, the common euphemism in that era for ailments that were either unknown or considered too delicate to discuss in public. The article went on to describe the funeral, which had taken place at the same chapel where Evelyn had been married. She was buried in her wedding dress, a practice that was not uncommon for young brides who died shortly after their nuptials. The piece concluded with the note that Mr. Jonathan Whitmore was inconsolable with grief and had stated his intention to never remarry, as his beloved wife had never truly left the chapel where they pledged their eternal love. Margaret leaned back in her chair, trying to process the information she had uncovered. The photograph she had purchased showed a bride who would be dead within 72 hours of the image being captured. But that still didn't explain the skeletal fingers visible in the bouquet. She turned her attention back to the photograph, studying every detail with renewed intensity. The chapel in the background was small and Gothic in style, with pointed arch windows and ivy climbing its stone walls. The wedding party was minimal, consisting of what appeared to be an elderly woman, who might have been a relative, a young man who could have been a friend or cousin of the groom, and a minister in traditional robes. Everyone appeared somber, even by the standards of formal photography from that period. But it was Evelyn herself who continued to draw Margaret's attention. The bride's posture was perfect, her hands positioned elegantly as she held her bouquet, but there was something in her expression that seemed almost expectant, as if she were waiting for something to happen. Her eyes, though difficult to read in the old photograph, seemed to be focused not on the camera, but on something beyond it, something that only she could see. Margaret decided to research the Whitmore family and the village of Millbrook. If this photograph had come from the estate sale, there might be a connection between the current owners and the people in the image. She spent the next several hours online, piecing together fragments of information about the family and the community where the wedding had taken place. What she discovered was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The village of Millbrook had been a thriving community in the early 1900s, centered around a textile mill that provided employment for most of the residents. St. Mary's Chapel, where Evelyn and Jonathan had been married and where she was later buried, had been built in 1865 and had served the spiritual needs of the community for nearly 50 years. But in 1908, less than a year after Evelyn's death, the village had been struck by a series of tragedies that ultimately led to its abandonment. The textile mill had burned down under mysterious circumstances, taking with it the economic foundation of the community. This was followed by an outbreak of what local newspapers described as a wasting illness that claimed the lives of nearly half the remaining residents. Most disturbing of all were the reports of supernatural occurrences that began to appear in regional newspapers during this period. Residents reported seeing a woman in a wedding dress walking through the village at night, always carrying a bouquet of wilted flowers. She was said to appear most frequently near the chapel, where witnesses claimed to hear the sound of wedding bells ringing at odd hours, despite the fact that the chapel had been abandoned after the minister died in the epidemic. By 1910, Millbrook was completely deserted. The few surviving residents had fled to other communities, leaving behind their homes and possessions. The village became known throughout the region as a cursed place, and local authorities eventually decided to flood the area as part of a dam construction project in 1922. The chapel and the rest of Millbrook now lay beneath the waters of Whitmore Reservoir, named ironically after the family that had owned much of the land in the area. Margaret felt a chill as she read about the reservoir. The estate sale where she had purchased the photograph had been held at the Whitmore mansion, which still stood on a hill overlooking the water that covered the village where Evelyn Carter had lived, married, and died. The current generation of Whitmores were descendants of Jonathan's brother, who had inherited the family property after Jonathan himself had disappeared in 1909. According to the historical records Margaret had found, Jonathan Whitmore had become increasingly erratic in the months following his wife's death. He was frequently seen at the chapel, sometimes spending entire nights there, talking to someone that no one else could see. Neighbors reported that he claimed Evelyn was still with him, that she had never really died, and that they continued to have conversations just as they had when she was alive. The last confirmed sighting of Jonathan Whitmore was on September 15, 1909, exactly 2 years after his wedding day. A local farmer reported seeing him walking toward the chapel, carrying a bouquet of roses and lilies, the same flowers that had been in Evelyn's wedding bouquet. When concerned community members went to check on him the next day, they found the chapel empty. Jonathan Whitmore was never seen again, though his body was never found. Margaret printed out the historical documents she had found and spread them across her workbench alongside the photograph. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, but it was a picture that challenged everything she believed about the nature of reality. She picked up the magnifying glass once more and examined the skeletal fingers in the bouquet, noting details she had missed before. The bones appeared to be those of a human hand, but they were impossibly clean and white, as if they had been bleached by some supernatural process. They were wrapped around the flower stems with a grip that suggested both desperation and possessiveness, as if whoever they belonged to was determined never to let go. Most disturbing of all, the fingers seemed to be emerging from within the flowers themselves, as if they were growing from the stems like some macabre botanical specimen. Margaret set down the magnifying glass and walked to the window, staring out at the rain that continued to fall on the empty street beyond. She had always prided herself on being a rational person, someone who approached the world with skepticism and demanded evidence for extraordinary claims. But the photograph on her workbench presented evidence of something that defied rational explanation. She returned to her computer and began searching for more recent information about Whitmore Reservoir and the surrounding area. What she found sent another chill down her spine. Over the years, there had been numerous reports of unusual incidents at the reservoir, particularly during the month of September. Fishermen told stories of seeing a woman in white walking on the surface of the water, always carrying what appeared to be a bouquet of flowers. Hikers reported hearing the sound of church bells coming from beneath the water on calm evenings. Most recently, a diving team that had been hired to inspect the dam structure in 2015 had reported finding the remains of the old chapel still standing on the bottom of the reservoir. According to their report, the building was remarkably well preserved, with stained glass windows still intact and pews arranged as if waiting for a congregation that would never come. But what had disturbed the divers most was what they found in the chapel itself. There, standing before the altar, were 2 figures that the divers initially thought were mannequins or statues. But closer examination revealed them to be the perfectly preserved bodies of a man and woman in wedding attire. The woman wore a dress that matched the one in Margaret's photograph, and she held a bouquet of what appeared to be fresh flowers, despite having been underwater for nearly a century. The diving team had attempted to photograph the figures, but their cameras had malfunctioned when they got close. When they tried to touch the bodies, the water around them had suddenly become ice cold, and several of the divers reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread that forced them to return to the surface. The official report had been classified, but Margaret found references to it in local newspaper archives and conspiracy theory websites. Margaret realized that she needed to see the reservoir for herself. She carefully wrapped the photograph and drove the 30 miles to the area where Millbrook had once stood. The Whitmore mansion still occupied its commanding position on the hill, though it now appeared run down and abandoned. The estate sale had apparently been the final chapter in the family's long occupation of the property. She parked her car near the boat launch and walked to the edge of the water. The reservoir stretched out before her, its dark surface reflecting the gray autumn sky. It was difficult to imagine that an entire village lay beneath those waters, complete with homes, businesses, and the chapel where Evelyn Carter had experienced both the happiest and the last days of her life. As Margaret stood at the water's edge, she found herself thinking about the bride in the photograph. Evelyn had been young, probably no more than 20 or 21, and according to the newspaper accounts, she had been well loved in the community. Her father had been a respected physician, and she had been known for her charitable work with the local orphanage. By all accounts, she had been a vibrant, caring young woman with her entire life ahead of her. What had happened to her in those 3 days between her wedding and her death? The newspaper had attributed her demise to sudden illness, but Margaret wondered if there might have been something more sinister involved. In an era when medical knowledge was limited and many conditions went undiagnosed, it was possible that Evelyn had been suffering from something that no one understood. But that still didn't explain the skeletal fingers in her wedding bouquet. Margaret pulled out her phone and looked at the digital photographs she had taken of the image. Even on the small screen, the bone-white appendages were clearly visible, gripping the flower stems with an intensity that seemed to transcend death itself. A movement on the water caught her attention. At first she thought it might be a bird or a piece of debris blown by the wind, but as she watched more carefully, she realized she was seeing something much more unusual. There, about 50 yards from shore, a figure appeared to be walking on the surface of the water. The figure was dressed in white and appeared to be carrying something in her arms. Margaret's rational mind immediately began offering explanations. It could be a trick of the light, a reflection of clouds on the water's surface, or perhaps a small boat that was difficult to see at this distance. But as she continued to watch, the figure became more distinct. It was definitely a woman, and she was definitely walking on the water rather than floating or being carried by a boat. The woman was moving slowly toward the shore, and as she got closer, Margaret could see that she was wearing a wedding dress. Her dark hair was arranged in the style of the early 1900s, and she carried a bouquet of flowers in her arms. With a shock of recognition, Margaret realized that she was looking at Evelyn Carter Whitmore, exactly as she had appeared in the photograph. Margaret's first instinct was to run, but something kept her rooted to the spot. The figure on the water was not threatening or frightening in any conventional sense. If anything, she appeared sad, almost pleading, as if she were trying to communicate something important. As Evelyn drew closer to shore, Margaret could see her face more clearly, and it was exactly as it had appeared in the photograph, young and beautiful, but marked by an expression of infinite sorrow. When Evelyn reached the water's edge, she did not step onto the shore, but remained standing on the surface of the lake, the water supporting her as if it were solid ground. She held out her bouquet toward Margaret, and for the first time, Margaret could see the flowers clearly. They were roses and lilies, just as they had been in the wedding photograph, but these flowers were wilted and blackened with age. And protruding from among the decaying blooms were the unmistakable shapes of skeletal fingers, gripping the stems with the same desperate intensity that Margaret had observed in the photograph. Evelyn's lips moved as if she were trying to speak, but no sound reached Margaret's ears. The bride's eyes, dark and luminous, were fixed on Margaret with an expression of desperate hope. It was clear that she was trying to communicate something of vital importance that transcended the barriers between the living and the dead. Margaret found her voice and whispered, "What do you want?" Evelyn's expression grew more urgent. She held the bouquet higher, shaking it slightly as if to draw Margaret's attention to the skeletal fingers among the flowers. Then she pointed back toward the water, toward the spot where the chapel lay beneath the surface. Her mouth continued to move, forming words that Margaret could not hear, but somehow began to understand. The message was simple, but heartbreaking. Find him. Margaret realized that Evelyn was not asking to be rescued or released from whatever supernatural force was keeping her bound to this place. She was asking for help in finding Jonathan, the husband who had disappeared 2 years after her death, and whose fate remained unknown. The skeletal fingers in the bouquet were not her own, Margaret realized with a shock. They belonged to Jonathan, and somehow his remains had become intertwined with the flowers that had been buried with his bride. As this understanding dawned on Margaret, Evelyn's expression changed. The desperate hope was replaced by something that might have been gratitude, as if she knew that her message had finally been received and understood. She nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and thanks, then began to fade like morning mist touched by sunlight. Within moments, the figure on the water had vanished completely, leaving only the gentle lapping of waves against the shore as evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Margaret stood alone at the water's edge, her heart pounding and her mind reeling from what she had witnessed. She looked down at her phone and was startled to discover that nearly 2 hours had passed since she had arrived at the reservoir. The encounter with Evelyn had felt like only a few minutes, but the sun was now setting behind the hills, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Margaret drove home in a daze, her mind struggling to process what she had experienced. She had always considered herself a skeptic when it came to supernatural phenomena, but there was no denying what she had seen. Evelyn Carter Whitmore was somehow still present in the world, bound to the place where she had lived and died, and she needed help in finding her missing husband. Back at her shop, Margaret spread out all the documents and photographs she had collected, trying to piece together a coherent picture of what had happened to Jonathan Whitmore after his wife's death. The historical records showed that he had become increasingly obsessed with the idea that Evelyn was still alive, still present in some form that others could not perceive. His behavior had grown so erratic that community leaders had begun to discuss the possibility of having him committed to an asylum. The last confirmed sighting of Jonathan had been on the 2nd anniversary of his wedding, when he was seen walking toward the chapel with a bouquet identical to the one Evelyn had carried as a bride. But what had happened to him after that? Margaret began to form a theory, one that was both romantic and terrifying in its implications. Perhaps Jonathan had not simply disappeared. Perhaps he had found a way to join his wife in whatever realm she now inhabited. The skeletal fingers in Evelyn's bouquet suggested that he was somehow connected to her, bound to her in death, as he had been unable to be in the brief span of their married life. Margaret spent the next several days researching everything she could find about the supernatural phenomena reported at Whitmore Reservoir. She discovered that the sightings of the woman in white had not been random occurrences. They followed a pattern, appearing most frequently on the anniversaries of Evelyn's wedding and death, and during the month of September when the tragedy had originally unfolded. She also found reports of other unusual phenomena associated with the reservoir. Fishermen told stories of lines being pulled underwater by some unseen force, only to be released moments later with bouquets of fresh flowers attached to the hooks. Divers who had worked on various projects over the years reported finding flowers scattered throughout the submerged village, always roses and lilies, always arranged as if they had recently been placed by human hands. Margaret began to understand that Evelyn and Jonathan were trapped in some sort of supernatural cycle, doomed to repeat the events of their brief marriage for eternity. But she also sensed that Evelyn's appearance to her had been different, more purposeful. The bride was not simply manifesting, as she had done countless times before. She was actively seeking help, trying to communicate with someone who might be able to understand and act on her message. Margaret decided to return to the reservoir on September 15th, the anniversary of Evelyn's wedding. If her theory was correct, this would be the most significant date in the supernatural calendar that governed the couple's existence. She prepared carefully, bringing waterproof cameras, recording equipment, and even a small boat that she rented from a marina several miles away. As the sun set on September 15th, Margaret positioned her boat over the approximate location of the submerged chapel. She had calculated the position using old maps and survey records, and she was confident that she was as close as possible to the spot where Evelyn and Jonathan had exchanged their vows over a century ago. At first, nothing happened. The water was calm and clear, and Margaret could see several feet down into the depths. She waited patiently, watching for any sign of the supernatural activity that had been reported by so many others over the years. Then, just as the clock on her phone showed that it was exactly midnight, the water beneath her boat began to glow with a soft, ethereal light. Margaret looked down and gasped at what she saw. The chapel was clearly visible beneath the surface, its Gothic architecture perfectly preserved, despite having been underwater for nearly a century. Stained glass windows glowed with their own inner light, and Margaret could see figures moving within the building. She lowered a waterproof camera into the water and was amazed to discover that it functioned normally, despite the numerous reports of equipment malfunctioning near the submerged chapel. Through the camera's viewfinder, she could see the interior of the chapel in remarkable detail. There, standing before the altar, were Evelyn and Jonathan Whitmore. They appeared exactly as they had on their wedding day, young and beautiful and radiating a love that had proven stronger than death itself. Jonathan was holding Evelyn's hands, and both of them were looking upward toward the surface of the water, toward Margaret's boat. Margaret realized that they could see her, just as Evelyn had seen her during their first encounter at the shore. She waved, and both figures waved back, their faces showing expressions of joy and gratitude. Then Evelyn held up her bouquet, and Margaret could see that the skeletal fingers were gone. The flowers were fresh and beautiful, roses and lilies in full bloom. Jonathan raised his own hands, and Margaret could see that they were whole and healthy, no longer the skeletal appendages that had been intertwined with his wife's bouquet. Whatever supernatural force had been keeping them trapped in a cycle of separation and loss had been broken by Margaret's understanding and acknowledgement of their plight. The couple turned toward each other and embraced, and as they did so, the light from the chapel grew brighter and more intense. Margaret watched in wonder as Evelyn and Jonathan began to fade, not disappearing as Evelyn had done during their first encounter, but transforming into something more ethereal and beautiful. They became pillars of light that rose from the chapel and passed through the water toward the surface. The lights emerged from the reservoir and continued upward into the night sky, becoming indistinguishable from the stars above. Margaret watched until they disappeared completely, leaving her alone on the dark water with a profound sense of peace and completion. When she developed the photographs from that night, Margaret was not surprised to find that they showed only the dark, empty water of the reservoir. The chapel, the figures, and the supernatural light had been visible only to her, a gift granted to someone who had cared enough to listen and understand. Margaret kept the original wedding photograph, but she had it reframed with a small brass plaque that told the story of Evelyn and Jonathan Whitmore. She displayed it prominently in her shop, and over the years, many customers stopped to admire it and to hear the tale of the bride whose love had proven stronger than death. The skeletal fingers never again appeared in the bouquet. Instead, the flowers looked fresh and beautiful, as if they had just been picked from a garden in full bloom. Margaret liked to think that this was Evelyn's way of thanking her, a sign that the young bride had finally found the peace that had eluded her for over a century. Years later, when Margaret was an old woman herself, she would sometimes drive out to Whitmore Reservoir on quiet evenings and sit by the water's edge. She never again saw the supernatural phenomena that had brought her into contact with Evelyn and Jonathan. But she always felt their presence, a gentle reminder that some bonds are truly eternal and that love, in its purest form, can transcend even the boundaries between life and death. The reservoir continued to be a place of mystery and legend, but the reports of supernatural activity gradually diminished and eventually ceased altogether. Local folklore suggested that the spirits of Millbrook had finally found rest, their long vigil ended by an act of compassion from someone who had been willing to listen and understand. Margaret never told anyone the full story of her encounters with Evelyn Carter Whitmore. She knew that most people would dismiss her account as fantasy or delusion, and she had no desire to subject herself to that kind of scrutiny. But she kept detailed notes about her experiences, and she often wondered if someday another person might need to hear the story, another soul who might find themselves called to help those caught between worlds. In the months that followed Margaret's supernatural encounter at Whitmore Reservoir, she found herself drawn deeper into the mystery surrounding the Whitmore family and the tragic fate of Millbrook Village. The peaceful resolution she had witnessed that September night had answered some questions, but it had also raised many others that demanded investigation. Margaret began receiving visitors at her antique shop, people who had heard whispered stories about her experience with the wedding photograph. Most were curiosity seekers or amateur paranormal investigators, but some brought with them pieces of information that added new dimensions to the story she thought she had completed. One particularly memorable visitor was an elderly woman named Clara Pemberton, who arrived on a crisp October morning carrying a leather satchel filled with yellow documents. Clara was the great-niece of Dr. Henry Carter, Evelyn's father, and she had spent decades collecting family papers and photographs that had been scattered among relatives after the doctor's death. Clara spread the documents across Margaret's workbench with trembling hands, her eyes bright with excitement at finally finding someone who would listen to the story she had been piecing together for most of her adult life. Among the papers were letters that Dr. Carter had written to colleagues in the months before his death, letters that painted a disturbing picture of the events leading up to Evelyn's wedding. According to these documents, Dr. Carter had been deeply concerned about his daughter's engagement to Jonathan Whitmore. It was not that he disapproved of the young man himself, who by all accounts was decent and hardworking, but rather that he had begun to notice troubling patterns in Evelyn's behavior after the engagement was announced. The letters described episodes where Evelyn would fall into trance-like states, during which she would speak in voices that were not her own. She would carry on conversations with invisible presences, often becoming agitated when others could not see or hear the entities she claimed were speaking to her. Dr. Carter had initially attributed these episodes to the stress of wedding preparations, but they had grown more frequent and intense as the wedding date approached. Most disturbing of all were Dr. Carter's notes about the physical changes he had observed in his daughter. Evelyn had always been slender, but in the weeks before her wedding, she had become almost skeletal in appearance, as if something were consuming her from within. Her skin had taken on a translucent quality, and her eyes had developed an otherworldly luminosity that her father found deeply unsettling. Dr. Carter had consulted with colleagues in Boston and New York, sharing his observations and seeking advice about his daughter's condition. The responses he received were not encouraging. Several physicians suggested that Evelyn might be suffering from a form of nervous exhaustion that was becoming increasingly common among young women of her social class. Others recommended that the wedding be postponed until she had recovered her health. But perhaps the most significant revelation in Dr. Carter's papers was his discovery of the true history of St. Mary's Chapel, where Evelyn was determined to hold her wedding ceremony. The chapel had not been built in 1865, as Margaret had previously believed. It had been constructed on the site of a much older structure, a colonial-era church that had been destroyed by fire in 1864, under circumstances that the community had preferred to forget. The original church had been the site of a notorious incident in 1792, when a young bride named Constance Hartwell had died at the altar during her wedding ceremony. According to the historical accounts that Dr. Carter had uncovered, Constance had been found clutching her bouquet so tightly that her fingers had to be broken to remove the flowers from her grasp. She was buried in her wedding dress, and within a year, her husband had died under mysterious circumstances, found in the church cemetery, with a bouquet of wilted flowers clutched in his skeletal hands. Dr. Carter had become convinced that there was some sort of supernatural curse associated with the site, something that drew young brides to their deaths and trapped their spirits in an endless cycle of longing and loss. He had tried to convince Evelyn to hold her wedding elsewhere, but she had been adamant that St. Mary's Chapel was the only place where she could marry Jonathan. In his final letter, written just 2 days before his own death, Dr. Carter had expressed his fear that his daughter was being influenced by the same malevolent forces that had claimed Constance Hartwell over Adele. Century earlier, he described finding Evelyn in the chapel at odd hours, always carrying a bouquet of roses and lilies, speaking to someone who was not there in a voice that was not entirely her own. Margaret studied these documents with growing unease, realizing that the story she had thought was complete was actually part of a much larger and more complex supernatural phenomenon. The skeletal fingers in Evelyn's wedding bouquet had not belonged to Jonathan, as she had initially believed. They had belonged to Constance Hartwell, the bride who had died at the altar in 1792, and whose spirit had been waiting for over a century to find someone who could help her escape the curse that bound her to the chapel. Clara Pemberton had more to share than just her great-great-uncle's papers. She had been conducting her own investigation into the history of Millbrook and the Whitmore family, and she had uncovered evidence that the supernatural phenomena associated with the area extended far beyond the two tragic brides. According to Clara's research, the land on which Millbrook had been built had been considered sacred by the indigenous peoples who had lived there before European settlement. It was believed to be a place where the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead was particularly thin, a crossing point where spirits could move freely between realms. The colonial settlers had ignored these warnings, establishing first a trading post and then a small community on the site. But the community had been plagued by unexplained deaths and supernatural manifestations from its earliest days. The pattern was always the same. Young women would begin experiencing visions and trances. They would become obsessed with the idea of marriage, and then they would die under mysterious circumstances, usually within days of their wedding ceremonies. The construction of the first church had been an attempt to sanctify the site and drive away whatever malevolent forces were at work there. But the church had only seemed to concentrate and intensify the supernatural activity. The fire that destroyed the original building in 1864 had been accompanied by reports of ghostly figures dancing in the flames, and several witnesses claimed to have seen the spirits of deceased brides rising from the ashes. Clara's research had revealed at least 7 documented cases of bride deaths associated with the site between 1792 and 1907. Each case followed a similar pattern. A young woman would become engaged, begin experiencing supernatural visions, waste away physically in the weeks before her wedding, and then die either on her wedding day or shortly thereafter. In most cases, the groom would subsequently disappear or die under mysterious circumstances. Margaret realized that Evelyn Carter had been the latest victim in a cycle of supernatural predation that had been repeating itself for over 2 centuries. But her encounter with Evelyn's spirit at the reservoir had somehow broken that cycle, freeing not just Evelyn and Jonathan, but potentially all of the trapped souls who had been caught in the supernatural web that centered on the chapel site. This theory was supported by Clara's most recent findings. Since Margaret's experience at Whitmore Reservoir in September, there had been no reported supernatural phenomena associated with the area. The sightings of ghostly brides, the mysterious flowers, and the sound of phantom church bells had all ceased. It was as if Margaret's act of understanding and compassion had finally allowed the restless spirits to find the peace that had eluded them for generations. But Clara had brought more than historical documents to Margaret's shop. She'd also brought a request, one that would draw Margaret even deeper into the supernatural mysteries surrounding Millbrook and the Whitmore family. Clara's own great-grandmother, Sarah Pemberton, had been one of the documented bride victims, dying in 1893, just hours after her wedding ceremony at St. Mary's Chapel. Like the others, Sarah had been found clutching her wedding bouquet with such intensity that her fingers had to be broken to remove the flowers. But unlike the others, Sarah had left behind a detailed diary that chronicled her experiences in the weeks leading up to her death. Clara had inherited this diary along with the other family documents, and she had been too frightened to read it until now. The diary, written in Sarah's careful script, provided an intimate first-person account of what it was like to fall under the supernatural influence that claimed the brides of Millbrook. Sarah described the initial visions as beautiful and comforting, visitations from what appeared to be other brides who welcomed her into their sisterhood. These ghostly figures would appear to her in dreams, and during quiet moments, always dressed in white and always carrying bouquets of roses and lilies. At first, Sarah had been delighted by these visitations. The ghostly brides seemed wise and loving, offering her advice about marriage and sharing stories of their own wedding days. But as her own wedding approached, the nature of these encounters began to change. The ghostly brides became more insistent, more demanding of her attention and energy. Sarah wrote about feeling increasingly disconnected from the physical world, as if she were being drawn into the realm inhabited by the ghostly brides. She described sensations of floating outside her own body, of watching herself from a distance as she went through the motions of daily life. Her physical form began to waste away, but she felt more alive and vibrant when she was with the ghostly brides than when she was interacting with living people. The most chilling entries in the diary described the night before Sarah's wedding. She wrote about being visited by all of the ghostly brides simultaneously, a gathering of spectral figures who filled her room with an otherworldly light. They explained to her that she had been chosen to join them, to become part of their eternal sisterhood. Her wedding would not be a beginning, but an ending, the moment when she would leave the mortal world behind and join them in their timeless realm. Sarah seemed to have accepted this fate with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Her final diary entry, written on the morning of her wedding, described her sense of moving toward an inevitable destiny. She wrote that she could feel herself already beginning to fade from the physical world, becoming more spirit than flesh with each passing hour. But it was the last paragraph of the diary that provided the most significant revelation. Sarah wrote that the ghostly brides had shown her visions of the future, glimpses of other young women who would be chosen to join their ranks. She described seeing Evelyn Carter, whom she identified by name even though Evelyn would not be born for another decade. But she also described seeing something else, something that filled her with hope rather than dread. Sarah wrote that the vision showed her a woman who would come from outside the community, someone who would have the power to break the cycle that trapped the ghostly brides in their supernatural prison. This woman would understand what others could not see, and her compassion would finally free all of the trapped souls to find their eternal rest. Margaret realized with a shock that Sarah Pemberton had seen her in those visions over a century before Margaret had been born. The young bride had known that her death was not meaningless, that it was part of a larger pattern that would eventually find its resolution through the intervention of someone who had not yet entered the world. Clara Pemberton had brought the diary to Margaret because she believed that Margaret was the woman Sarah had seen in her visions. But she had also brought a request that went beyond simple historical curiosity. Clara had spent her entire adult life feeling guilty about her great-grandmother's fate, wondering if there was something she could have done to prevent the tragedy if she had been alive at the time. Now that Margaret had apparently freed the ghostly brides from their supernatural prison, Clara wanted to know if there was a way to communicate with Sarah's spirit, to let her know that she had not been forgotten, and that her sacrifice had not been in vain. Clara hoped that Margaret might be able to use her apparent supernatural sensitivity to make contact with Sarah, just as she had been able to help Evelyn and Jonathan find their peace. Margaret was initially reluctant to attempt such a communication. Her experience at Whitmore Reservoir had been emotionally and psychologically exhausting, and she was not sure she was ready to open herself up to further supernatural encounters. But Clara's obvious pain and her genuine desire to honor her great-grandmother's memory eventually convinced Margaret to make the attempt. They decided to conduct a séance, for lack of a better term, at Margaret's shop rather than at the reservoir. Clara brought Sarah's diary and several personal items that had belonged to her great-grandmother, including a locket that contained a photograph of Sarah on her wedding day and a pressed flower from her bridal bouquet. Margaret had never attempted to deliberately contact a spirit before. Her encounter with Evelyn had been spontaneous and unexpected, driven by the bride's own desperate need to communicate, rather than by any conscious effort on Margaret's part. But she hoped that her apparent sensitivity to supernatural phenomena might allow her to reach across the veil and make contact with Sarah Pemberton. They waited until after sunset, when the shop was closed and the street outside was quiet. Margaret arranged the items that Clara had brought on her workbench, creating a sort of shrine to Sarah's memory. The pressed flower was particularly poignant, its petals still retaining a faint trace of color despite being over a century old. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. Margaret tried to open her mind to any supernatural presence that might be trying to communicate, while Clara sat quietly nearby, clutching Sarah's diary and hoping for some sign that her great-grandmother's in Croft. Spirit was aware of their efforts. Then, just as Margaret was beginning to think that the attempt would be unsuccessful, the temperature in the room began to drop. It was a gradual change at first, barely noticeable, but it quickly became more pronounced. Their breath began to mist in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started to form on the windows of the shop. Margaret felt the now familiar sensation of being in the presence of something that existed beyond the boundaries of the physical world. But unlike her encounters with Evelyn, which had been marked by sadness and desperation, this presence radiated a sense of peace and contentment. A figure began to materialize near the workbench, translucent at first, but becoming more solid with each passing moment. Margaret recognized her immediately from the photograph in the locket. Sarah Pemberton appeared exactly as she had on her wedding day, young and beautiful in her white dress, holding a bouquet of roses and lilies that looked as fresh as if they had just been picked. But there was something different about Sarah's appearance that set her apart from the ghostly bride that Margaret had seen in Evelyn's wedding photograph. Sarah's flowers showed no trace of skeletal fingers. Her bouquet was pure and beautiful, unmarred by any sign of the supernatural corruption that had once bound her to the cursed site. Sarah smiled at Margaret and Clara, her expression radiating gratitude and joy. When she spoke, her voice was clear and musical, entirely unlike the desperate whispers that had characterized Evelyn's attempts at communication. "Thank you," Sarah said simply. "Thank you for freeing us." Clara gasped, and reached toward her great-grandmother, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry we couldn't help you." Sarah's smile grew even more radiant. "There was nothing you could have done, dear one. It was my time to serve, just as it was Margaret's time to free us. Everything happened exactly as it was meant to happen." Margaret found her voice and asked, "Are you all at peace now? All of the brides who were trapped?" "We are," Sarah confirmed. "We have found our way to the light, and we are with our loved ones again. Constance is here, and Evelyn, and all the others. We are grateful beyond words for your compassion and understanding." Clara leaned forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've read your diary, grandmother. I know how frightened you were at the end." Sarah's expression grew tender. "I was frightened because I did not understand what was happening to me. But now I know that fear was unnecessary. Death is not an ending but a transformation. And love truly is stronger than death." Jonathan found his way to Evelyn, just as my beloved William found his way to me. Margaret realized that Sarah was referring to her husband, who according to historical records had died mysteriously several months after Sarah's death. Like Jonathan Whitmore, William Pemberton had apparently been unable to live without his bride, and had found a way to join her in whatever realm she inhabited. "The cycle is broken now," Sarah continued. "No more young women will be drawn to their deaths at that accursed site. The land can finally heal, and the living can build their lives there without fear of supernatural interference." She turned to Margaret with an expression of profound gratitude. "You have a gift, Margaret. You have the ability to see beyond the veil and to help those who are trapped between worlds. This may not be the last time you are called upon to use this gift." Margaret felt a chill at these words. She had hoped that her experience with Evelyn and Jonathan would be a unique occurrence, not the beginning of a series of supernatural encounters. But Sarah's words suggested that Margaret's sensitivity to paranormal phenomena might draw her into other situations where her help would be needed. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that," Margaret admitted. "The experience at the reservoir was almost more than I could handle." Sarah's expression grew compassionate. "Strength comes not from the absence of fear, but from the willingness to act despite that fear. You have already proven that you possess the courage and compassion needed to help those who cannot help themselves. Trust in yourself, and trust in the forces of light that will guide and protect you." Clara had been listening to this exchange with growing wonder. "Is there anything I can do? Any way I can help?" Sarah turned to her descendant with obvious love. "You have already helped more than you know. Your dedication to preserving our family's history, your refusal to let our stories be forgotten, created the connection that allowed Margaret to learn the truth about what happened to us. Continue to be a keeper of memories, dear one. The past has lessons to teach the present, if only we are willing to listen." The room began to grow warmer, and Sarah's figure started to fade around the edges. Margaret realized that the visit was coming to an end, that the spirit was preparing to return to whatever peaceful realm she now inhabited. "Before you go," Margaret said quickly, "is there anything else we should know? Any other supernatural dangers that we should be aware of?" Sarah paused, her form solidifying again as she considered the question. "The land itself is healing, but healing takes time. There may still be residual phenomena, echoes of the past that will fade gradually over the years. Be patient with these manifestations. They are not malevolent, merely the lingering memories of old pain working their way out of the fabric of reality." She looked directly at Margaret. "And remember that not all supernatural encounters are negative. Some spirits are simply lost and need help finding their way. Others have messages of love and hope to share with the living. Keep your heart open, but also keep your wisdom sharp. Learn to distinguish between those who need help and those who might wish you harm." With these final words, Sarah Pemberton smiled once more at her great-granddaughter and at Margaret, then dissolved into motes of golden light that danced briefly in the air before disappearing entirely. The temperature in the room returned to normal, and the frost on the windows melted away as if it had never existed. Clara and Margaret sat in silence for several minutes, both trying to process what they had experienced. Finally, Clara spoke, her voice filled with wonder. "She looked so happy," Clara whispered. "So peaceful. I always imagined her as trapped and suffering, but she seemed genuinely joyful." Margaret nodded. I think that's the most important thing we can take away from this experience. Death is not the end, and love really is stronger than any force that tries to separate us from those we care about. In the weeks that followed, Margaret found herself thinking often about Sarah's warning that she might be called upon to use her supernatural sensitivity again. She wondered what form such a calling might take, and whether she would have the courage to respond when the time came. Her question was answered sooner than she expected. In November, less than a month after her encounter with Sarah Pemberton, Margaret received a phone call from a woman named Dr. Rebecca Norton, a professor of paranormal studies at a university in the neighboring state. Dr. Norton had heard about Margaret's experience from Clara Pemberton, who had become something of a local celebrity after word of the seance spread through the community. Dr. Norton explained that she had been investigating reports of supernatural activity at a historic inn located about 2 hours from Margaret's shop. The inn, built in the 1820s, had been experiencing a series of unexplained phenomena over the past several months. Guests reported seeing figures in period dress walking the hallways at night, and several had awakened to find their rooms filled with the scent of flowers that were not present in any physical form. Most disturbing of all were the reports of the woman in a white dress who appeared in the inn's bridal suite, always carrying a bouquet of wilted flowers. The apparition never spoke or made any threatening gestures, but her presence was so melancholy that guests found it impossible to remain in the room. The inn's owners had been forced to stop renting the bridal suite, and they were becoming desperate for a solution to their supernatural problem. Dr. Norton had exhausted the usual approaches to paranormal investigation without achieving any meaningful results. Electronic equipment malfunctioned in the presence of the apparition, and attempts to communicate through traditional seance methods had been unsuccessful. She had heard about Margaret's apparently unique ability to communicate with troubled spirits, and she was hoping that Margaret might be willing to visit the inn and attempt to make contact with whatever entity was causing the disturbances. Margaret was initially reluctant to become involved. Her experiences with Evelyn and Sarah had been emotionally draining, and she was not sure she was ready to take on another supernatural investigation. But something about Dr. Norton's description of the lonely figure in the bridal suite reminded her of Evelyn Carter, and she found herself unable to ignore the possibility that another troubled spirit might be in need of help. She agreed to visit the inn on the condition that Dr. Norton would provide her with as much historical background as possible about the building and its previous owners. If Margaret was going to attempt communication with a supernatural entity, she wanted to understand the context and circumstances that might have led to the haunting. Dr. Norton's research revealed that the inn had indeed been the site of several tragic events over its nearly 2-century history. The most significant occurred in 1857, when a young bride named Catherine Morrison had died on her wedding night, under circumstances that remained unexplained. Catherine had married her childhood sweetheart in a ceremony held in the inn's main parlor, and the couple had retired to the bridal suite for their wedding night. The next morning, Catherine was found dead in the bridal suite, apparently having died in her sleep. Her new husband, David Morrison, was found sitting beside her body, clutching a bouquet of flowers and speaking to someone who was not there. He claimed that Catherine was still alive, still speaking to him, and he refused to leave her side even when it became clear that she had passed away. David Morrison was eventually committed to an asylum, where he spent the remaining 20 years of his life, insisting that his wife was still with him. He died in 1877, and according to asylum records, his last words were a promise to Catherine that he would find her and bring her flowers. Margaret realized that the haunting at the inn was likely connected to Catherine Morrison's death and her husband's subsequent mental breakdown. The apparition in the bridal suite was probably Catherine herself, trapped in the location where she had died, and waiting for David to fulfill his promise to find her. When Margaret arrived at the inn, she was struck by its resemblance to the settings of her previous supernatural encounters. Like St. Mary's Chapel and the Whitmore Mansion, the inn possessed an atmosphere of faded grandeur tinged with an underlying sadness. The building was beautifully maintained, but there was something in its very architecture that seemed to echo with the memories of past tragedies. Dr. Norton met Margaret at the inn and provided her with a tour of the building, paying particular attention to the bridal suite where most of the supernatural activity had been reported. The room was elegantly furnished with period antiques, and it should have been a romantic and inviting space. But Margaret felt the familiar chill that she had come to associate with supernatural presences as soon as she entered the room. That evening, Margaret decided to spend the night in the bridal suite, hoping that her presence there might encourage the troubled spirit to make contact. Dr. Norton had offered to stay with her, but Margaret felt that she might have better success if she were alone. Her previous supernatural encounters had been private, intimate experiences, and she suspected that the presence of an academic observer might inhibit any attempt at communication. Margaret settled into the room's antique armchair and tried to open her mind to whatever supernatural presence might be sharing the space with her. For the first few hours, nothing unusual occurred. The room remained quiet and still, and Margaret began to wonder if the spirit had somehow moved on, or if her presence was simply not conducive to manifestation. Then, shortly after midnight, the temperature in the room began to drop, and Margaret caught the scent of flowers in the air. It was not the fresh, sweet fragrance of a bridal bouquet, but rather the musty, cloying smell of flowers that had been left too long in a closed room. A figure began to materialize in the corner of the room, translucent at first, but gradually becoming more solid. Margaret recognized the apparition immediately from Dr. Norton's descriptions. Catherine Morrison appeared to be in her early 20s, with dark hair arranged in the elaborate style of the 1850s. She wore a white nightgown rather than a wedding dress, and she held a bouquet of flowers that were clearly in an advanced state of decay. Catherine's expression was one of profound sadness and confusion. She seemed to be looking around the room as if searching for someone who was not there, and her lips moved as if she were trying to speak to an invisible companion. Margaret stood up slowly, not wanting to startle the spirit. "Catherine?" she said softly. "Catherine Morrison?" The apparition turned toward Margaret, and for a moment her eyes focused on the living woman with an expression of hope and desperate need. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, but Margaret could understand her words clearly. "Where is David?" Catherine asked. "He promised he would come back to me. He promised he would bring me flowers." Margaret's heart ached for the confused spirit. Catherine had been waiting in this room for over 150 years, not understanding that she had died and that her husband had been unable to cope with her loss. Like Evelyn Carter, she was trapped by her own refusal to accept death, and by her longing for a reunion that could not take place in the physical world. "Catherine," Margaret said gently, "David did try to come back to you. He loved you so much that he couldn't accept your death. He spent the rest of his life trying to be with you." Catherine's expression grew more focused, more alert. "He did come back, but I cannot see him. I cannot hear him." Margaret realized that she was dealing with a situation similar to what she had encountered with Evelyn and Jonathan. Catherine and David were both trapped in a supernatural limbo, unable to find each other despite their desperate desire to be reunited. Catherine was bound to the location where she had died, while David's spirit was probably trapped in the asylum where he had spent his final years. "He's not here because he died somewhere else," Margaret explained. "But I think I can help you find him. You need to let go of this place, Catherine. You need to stop waiting for him to come to you and start looking for him in the realm where spirits go when they leave the physical world." Catherine looked down at the decaying bouquet in her hands, and Margaret could see understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. "These flowers," Catherine whispered, "they never stay fresh. They always wilt and die, no matter how often David brings them to me." "Because they're not real flowers," Margaret said gently. "They're a memory, an echo of the love David felt for you. The real flowers, the ones that will never wilt, are waiting for you in the place where David is now." Catherine raised her eyes to meet Margaret's gaze. "How do I find this place? How do I leave this room?" Margaret thought about her experiences with Evelyn and Sarah, both of whom had been freed from their supernatural prisons by acts of understanding and compassion. "You have to stop being afraid," she said. "You have to trust that love really is stronger than death, and that David is waiting for you somewhere beyond the boundaries of this physical world." Catherine nodded slowly, and as she did so, the decaying bouquet in her hands began to change. The wilted petals fell away, revealing fresh, vibrant blooms underneath. The roses and lilies glowed with their own inner light, beautiful beyond anything that could exist in the physical world. "I can feel him," Catherine whispered, wonder filling her voice. "I can feel David calling to me." She looked at Margaret with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you for helping me understand. I was so confused, so afraid. I thought if I left this room, I would lose him forever." "You'll never lose him," Margaret assured her. "Love like yours doesn't end with death. It just finds new ways to express itself." Catherine smiled, and as she did so, her entire form began to glow with the same ethereal light that emanated from her bouquet. "I can see him now," she said. "He's here, reaching for me." Margaret watched as Catherine stepped forward, moving towards something that only she could see. As she moved, her form became more translucent, more ethereal, until she was little more than a shimmer of light in the air. Then, with a final flash of brilliance, she disappeared completely, leaving behind only the lingering scent of fresh flowers and a profound sense of peace. Margaret spent the rest of the night in the bridal suite, but she encountered no further supernatural phenomena. When Dr. Norton arrived the next morning, Margaret was able to report that the haunting had been successfully resolved. In the days that followed, the inn's owners confirmed that all supernatural activity had ceased. The bridal suite could once again be rented to guests, and several couples reported that it was the most romantic and peaceful room they had ever stayed in. Word of Margaret's success at the inn spread quickly through the small but dedicated community of paranormal researchers and investigators. She began receiving requests for help from people all over the region who were dealing with troublesome hauntings or unexplained supernatural phenomena. Margaret found herself reluctantly becoming something of a specialist in helping trapped spirits find their way to whatever realm awaited them beyond death. Each case was different, but they all shared certain common elements. Spirits who had been traumatically separated from their loved ones, entities who were confused about their own death, and supernatural presences who needed help understanding that love could transcend the boundaries between life and death. Some cases were relatively simple, requiring nothing more than gentle explanation and reassurance. Others were more complex, involving multiple spirits or supernatural phenomena that had developed over many years or even decades. But in every instance, Margaret found that the key to resolution was the same: compassion, understanding, and the willingness to help confused souls find their way home. As her reputation grew, Margaret began to realize that Sarah Pemberton had been right about her having a gift that would be needed again and again. She was apparently one of those rare individuals who could serve as a bridge between the world of the living and the world of the dead, helping to heal the wounds that sometimes kept spirits trapped in a supernatural limbo. It was not always easy work. Each supernatural encounter drained her emotionally and physically, and there were times when she questioned whether she had the strength to continue. But the gratitude of the spirits she helped, and the peace that invariably followed their release, made all of the difficulty worthwhile. Margaret's experiences also changed her perspective on life and death in profound ways. She no longer feared death as an ending, but understood it as a transition, a doorway to a realm where love could continue in new and more perfect forms. She saw her work with troubled spirits not as dealing with the supernatural, but as facilitating natural processes that had been disrupted by trauma, confusion, or fear. Years passed, and Margaret's collection of supernatural encounter stories grew. Each case taught her something new about the nature of life after death, and about the incredible power of love to transcend any obstacle or barrier. She began to keep detailed records of her experiences, not for publication or academic study, but as a resource that might someday help others who found themselves called to similar work. The wedding photograph that had started her journey remained prominently displayed in her shop, but now it was surrounded by other mementos from her supernatural investigations. There were pressed flowers from Catherine Morrison's ghostly bouquet, which had somehow remained fresh despite being over a century old. There was a locket that had belonged to another tragic bride, a woman whose spirit Margaret had helped reunite with her lost love. And there were photographs and documents from dozens of other cases, each one representing a successful reunion between souls who had been separated by death, but who had refused to accept that separation as cause. Final. Margaret never advertised her supernatural services or sought publicity for her work. Word of mouth was sufficient to bring her all the cases she could handle, and she preferred to maintain a low profile. She had learned that not everyone was ready to accept the reality of life after death, or the possibility that love could survive the transition from the physical to the spiritual realm. But for those who did believe, for those who had lost loved ones and wondered whether they would ever see them again, Margaret's work offered hope and comfort. Her experiences had proven beyond doubt that consciousness survived death, that the bonds of love were truly eternal, and that separation was only temporary for those who genuinely cared for each other. As Margaret grew older, she began to think about what would happen to her gift when she was no longer able to use it. Would there be others who could take up the work of helping trapped spirits find their way home? Or would her death mark the end of a brief period when the veil between worlds had been particularly thin? She found her answer in an unexpected way, when a young woman named Jessica arrived at her shop with a story that was remarkably similar to Margaret's own initial encounter with the supernatural. Jessica had purchased an antique mirror at an estate sale and had begun seeing faces in it that were not reflections of anyone in the room. The faces appeared to be those of people from different historical periods, all looking out from the mirror with expressions of longing and sadness. Jessica had initially dismissed the phenomena as tricks of light or imagination, but the faces had become more distinct and more frequent over time. She had come to Margaret after hearing about her reputation for dealing with supernatural problems, hoping for advice about how to make the visions stop. But as Jessica described her experiences, Margaret realized that the young woman was not dealing with a haunted mirror. She was demonstrating the same sensitivity to supernatural phenomena that Margaret herself possessed. The faces in the mirror were spirits who were drawn to Jessica's natural ability to perceive them, souls who sensed that she might be able to help them, just as Margaret had helped so many others. Margaret spent several hours with Jessica, sharing her own experiences and explaining the nature of the gift they apparently both possessed. She described the challenges and rewards of supernatural investigation work, and she offered to serve as a mentor if Jessica decided to accept the calling that seemed to be developing. Jessica was initially overwhelmed by the implications of what Margaret was telling her. Like Margaret, she had considered herself a skeptic when it came to supernatural phenomena, and the idea that she might be destined to spend her life helping troubled spirits was both fascinating and terrifying. But as they talked, Jessica began to understand that her gift was not a burden, but an opportunity to serve others in a way that few people ever could. The faces in the mirror were not trying to frighten her, but were reaching out for help, just as Evelyn Carter had reached out to Margaret years earlier. Margaret offered to accompany Jessica on her first supernatural investigation, a case involving a historic theater where actors reported seeing a woman in 1920s dress sitting in the balcony during rehearsals and performances. The apparition never interfered with the productions, but her presence was so melancholy that it affected the mood of everyone in the building. Together, Margaret and Jessica discovered that the theater ghost was the spirit of a young actress named Victoria Kane who had died in a car accident on opening night of what was to have been her breakthrough performance in 1927. Victoria had been so devastated at missing her chance for stardom that she had remained bound to the theater, watching countless other performances while unable to participate in the art form she had loved more than life itself. Jessica proved to have a natural talent for supernatural communication, and she was able to help Victoria understand that her death had not ended her connection to the theater, but had simply changed the nature of that connection. Victoria's spirit had been inspiring actors and audiences for nearly a century, her love for the dramatic arts infusing every performance with an extra dimension of emotion and authenticity. Once Victoria understood that she had been contributing to the theater's success all along, she was able to let go of her regret and disappointment. She appeared to Jessica and Margaret one final time during their investigation, radiant with joy and gratitude, before dissolving into sparkles of golden light that seemed to bless the theater with their presence. The successful resolution of Victoria's case convinced Jessica to accept her supernatural calling, and Margaret found herself with a protégé who could eventually carry on the work of helping troubled spirits. They worked together on several more investigations over the following months, with Margaret gradually taking a less active role as Jessica developed confidence in her abilities. One of their most challenging cases involved a Civil War battlefield where the spirits of soldiers from both armies had remained trapped for over 150 years. Unable to understand why they continued to fight a war that had ended generations ago, the battlefield had become a site of intense paranormal activity, with visitors reporting the sounds of gunfire and cannon blasts, the sight of ghostly figures in military uniforms, and an overwhelming sense of violence and chaos. Margaret and Jessica spent several nights on the battlefield, gradually making contact with the confused spirits who had been locked in eternal combat. They discovered that the soldiers had died so suddenly and violently that many of them did not realize they were dead. They continued to perceive the battle as ongoing, trapped in the final moments of their lives by their inability to comprehend what had happened to them. The breakthrough came when Jessica was able to make contact with a young drummer boy whose spirit seemed less affected by the combat trauma than the adult soldiers. Through the drummer boy, Margaret and Jessica were able to communicate with the other trapped souls, helping them understand that the war was over and that they were free to lay down their arms and find the peace that awaited them. The resolution of this case required multiple visits to the battlefield and careful work with each individual spirit, but eventually, all of the trapped soldiers were able to move on to whatever realm awaited them. The battlefield became peaceful for the first time in over a century, and it was eventually converted into a memorial park where visitors could honor the memory of those who had died there without being disturbed by supernatural phenomena. As Jessica took on more responsibility for supernatural investigations, Margaret found herself able to return to her primary work as an antique dealer. But her experiences with the paranormal had fundamentally changed her relationship with the objects she bought and sold. She had developed an ability to sense which items carried emotional residues from their previous owners, and she often found herself serving as an informal counselor for customers who had inherited pieces with troubling histories. Margaret's legacy as both an antique dealer and a supernatural investigator eventually brought her to the attention of museums and historical societies, organizations that occasionally dealt with their own paranormal problems. She was consulted on several cases involving historic houses and buildings where supernatural activity was interfering with educational programs or public tours, always approaching each situation with the same compassion and understanding that had characterized her work from the beginning. The wedding photograph remained in a place of honor in her shop until the day she died, a testament to a love story that had begun in joy, continued through tragedy, and finally found its resolution through the kindness of a stranger who had been willing to believe in the impossible. Margaret's story became part of the local folklore surrounding Whitmore Reservoir, passed down through generations of antique dealers, historians, and those who collected tales of the supernatural. But for those who knew Margaret personally, it was more than just a ghost story. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important discoveries are not the valuable antiques or rare collectibles that fill our shops and museums, but the human connections that transcend time, death, and all the barriers that seem to separate us from one another. In the end, Margaret's encounter with Evelyn Carter Whitmore taught her that the past is never truly past, and that love, in its most powerful form, creates bonds that no force in heaven or earth can ultimately break.